Morning, George. It's Super Tuesday, and we have a super guest today.
Yeah, today we have Dr. Scott Grant. He's formerly an academic pediatrician that transitioned to independent practice while being a dad and a podcaster. So we're going to talk about his life story, and it sounds interesting. We were chatting a little bit before we started, and I'm impressed. Take it away.
Hey, Scott, welcome to the show. It's good to see you again.
Hi, thank you.
We always ask the same question. Why did you become a pediatrician?
I love taking care of kids and families. I know that's the go-to boilerplate answer, but it just is true for me. Even when I was a young kid, volunteering at my church, these kinds of things, always was drawn to like how fun it was to play with kids and help them learn and all of those kinds of things. And did a lot of work with my parents in our church, like volunteering with the preschool kids and those kinds of things. And to this day, that's still one of my favorite ages to interact with. And then as I figured out, like, how do I put this with some of my other interests in science and math and those kinds of things, going to medical school to become a pediatrician made sense. I always tell folks I wanted to be a pediatrician before I knew that meant I had to go to medical school. I went to medical school with the idea that I was probably going to be a pediatrician, like 95% chance that was where I was headed. I tried to keep an open mind as I went through the first few years and into the third year to see, was there something else that I want to do? Thought a little bit about OBGYN and the babies and maybe family medicine as a way to do all of that. And then really just came all the way back around to say pediatrics is where I want to be. We have a ton of fun and the hospitals are painted pretty and colorful. It's a nice place to work. Most people who work with kids are happy, friendly folks. And it was just a nice place for me to work and also to get to do the work that I love to do, which is working with kids, keeping them healthy, but also stepping into those with those families and going on the journey with them to help them make sure that they have the information that they need to raise happy, healthy kids, which is what we all want.
Yeah.
Great. Scott, you were one of the last, what I call true pediatricians in academia, right? You were at Detroit Children's, but you were doing inpatient and you did clinic too.
Yeah, I was definitely a unicorn there. I think I was the only one left doing that there. There's still a couple of folks. I recently relocated back down here to Phoenix. I know there's at least one person left in Phoenix that's still doing both, at least at the big children's hospital, where they do some clinic and some hospitalist work. But I think that for me, it was just, I couldn't decide. I loved them both so much. They're such different experiences, right? In the clinic, you're like in the weeds of the day to day with these families and helping them through some of these little things like what are the developmental milestones and when do we start introducing solid foods and the well checks and the development and that kind of more longitudinal experience of like, how do I help these families in the day to day grow and develop their families in a meaningful way? And then on the inpatient side in the hospital, you're in it with these families on the worst day of their lives. I used to tell the residents, like, you have to remember that we're here in the hospital every single day. This is a normal place to be for us. But for these families, for most of them, this is the worst day of their life, right? They have a kid who's sick enough to have to be in the hospital. And here they are at a large academic center. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people coming in and out of the rooms. It can be a little bit scary, a little bit overwhelming. And so you have an opportunity to try to step into that and try to ease that frustration and ease that anxiety a little bit as you're trying to help that kid get better by helping those families through that. And it's two totally different experiences, but it really helped me understand the full spectrum of what parents experience as they're trying to raise their kids, even before I had kids of my own.
Yeah, I think most international pediatricians do that. They do outpatient consults and then they run the pediatric wards and do the ER consults, and they have very satisfying lives because they see the whole spectrum. Not so in the US. We've become hyper high specialized. Yeah, so it's a very different one.
Yeah, definitely very different. Even being there, it was definitely the case that I was working sort of two different jobs. I was half in the clinic and half in the hospital. And it wasn't this sort of seamless experience, really. I had two division meetings to go to and two division chiefs to answer to, I was working two different jobs in two different divisions. It's still divided that way as it is in so many places. It came with its own set of sort of administrative challenges as I tried to navigate keeping my schedule the way that it needed to be to keep everybody happy with the work that I was doing. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a nice balance. And for what it's worth, I talked to a lot of residents who looked at that job that I had and thought it looked really appealing to get to do all these different things because that's still that there's still some remnants of that age where you used to be able
Mhm.
to do a little bit of everything. And now in a lot of places, the only thing you can do if you want to do clinic and hospital is maybe some newborn. You can find a place to go and round on some newborns if you really want to. Although even that, it just gets really difficult depending on what kind of practice you're operating in.
Why do you think it's important to round on the newborns? Most people don't want to go anymore.
Yeah, and in full disclosure, at the practice I'm at now, like we don't do that currently either, unfortunately. But I think there's value in developing those relationships from the earliest days, right from the jump. Especially some of these families I'm getting to know, I see their older kids, and they're pregnant with another baby, and they're gonna deliver them. And I just
Right.
think, how cool would it be if that next morning after baby was delivered, or even that night, depending on what happens, if I was the one who walked in the door and said, "Hey, how are things going? Are you guys coping okay?" And there's that existing relationship there. And even if it's a new relationship, it's useful, I think. And we definitely found, even working as a hospitalist before, where I was rounding on newborns, the way that a general pediatrician, and most of the hospitalists now, we're still trained as general pediatricians because we're not that far into the hospitalist era. And the way a neonatologist thinks about rounding on babies is so different. We just have totally different perspectives on these babies in the first couple of days of life, that I think it's really meaningful to have that perspective of the general pediatrician who's thinking about troubleshooting breastfeeding when challenges come up, and staying in the mess with the family to say, what are those challenges that are going to come up and how can I help you with that? Rather than, I think sometimes we over medicalize what's happening in those first couple of days of life. And that can be a challenge as parents are trying to bond with their new baby and those kinds of things. I think that's the unique perspective that we can bring.
Yeah, I can tell you, we still round the hospital and see newborns. One of the few practices that still do.
Yeah.
Parents really appreciate it when we show up. I'm not the one that goes every day, with a couple of us, so every day is a different person. But the parents are really excited when we walk in the door. Dr. Ogu, thanks for coming. Or on the other extreme, you're doing the college checkup for a kid, and then the mother says, "Do you know Dr. Rowe was the first one to see you, examine you when you were born?" All these things, they don't matter. From the NBA point of view, it doesn't
Mhm.
generate any money. But you know what? It is priceless.
Yeah, it's those relationships that you develop over time that are so important. And that's where kind of the value that we bring as pediatricians, as primary care pediatricians, that's where a lot of the value that we come from. And it's sometimes hard to capture, like you said, because it doesn't generate revenue. But I think in so many ways, if you want to like turn it into an economic argument, that relationship matters, because when it comes to a kid gets sick and we're having to make a decision like, how much workup do we need to do? Or are we going to do antibiotics? Those families that I have existing relationships with are a lot easier to convince that this infection that their child has doesn't need antibiotics or doesn't need $1 million workup, and that like it's okay to wait a little while longer, right? And it's in that relationship that we can trust each other to make the right choice for the child, right?
Right.
And then it also, on the other side, it does also lead us to a place where when something is going wrong, and I say, this is something that needs to be taken care of today, like they take that seriously and they drop what they're doing and they go immediately to the emergency room or something like that in a situation where kids need labs drawn or those kinds of things. And it's that sort of, it's the trust of that relationship that allows us to steer the ship more efficiently. And that's maybe the economic argument for the value that we bring.
Now, do you think when you worked on the other side, in the hospitalist side or the clinic side, did you have that kind of relationship, or did people listen to you as much? Or
You mean in the academic world as compared to
like when you had a
like the
patient that was seriously ill, or in the morning when you saw them in the nursery, yeah, you must have had a relationship somehow.
Yeah, yeah, we did develop, relationships over time. I would say in the clinic, it's a little bit different where I was, on the academic side compared to where I am now, because now I'm working in an independent, practice, and so I'm going in and I'm the one having these conversation with families. When I was in the academic clinic, I was almost exclusively staffing residents, so the residents were the ones going in and really developing that relationship and really doing the frontline work of taking care of these families, and I would come in, especially if they were nervous about something, concerned about something, I would be the one that would come in and have to develop that relationship a little bit more quickly. certainly on the inpatient side, you're seeing those kids, my practice frequently because I'm there as a hospitalist, so I'm there all day anyway. To like those kids I'm worried about, I'm going back in to check in and see how things are going, talk to the family a little bit more, tell me how this all kind of got started, where are we at? And so you definitely develop a relationship there, but it's a different kind of relationship, right? In the outpatient world, we're talking longitudinally. I'm going to see you today and I'm going to see you again in a couple of weeks and a month after that and 2 months after that. In the inpatient world, you're diving deep. Again, this is the worst day of their life, and I need to know everything that I can about how we got to where we are now. And so the tactics that you use to develop those relationships are different, but that's the way the
Do you think that perhaps telehealth is a good solution to bridge these two worlds? So you have a neonatologist that is seeing the newborns. In our area, it is because of financial constraint. The community hospitals cannot sustain the salary for the neonatologist unless they take over all the newborns. That's just as simple as even if you want to go, they won't let you in the nursery. And but perhaps using telehealth, you could still see your parents when the child is born in the hospital, but allow the neonatologist to keep the revenue so they could still go to the C-section.
Yeah, and we definitely have to think about, you talk a lot about this, Dr. Bravo. I think it's important to remember that we need these services in these hospitals, in the communities. And so we do need to find a way to make sure that these moms and babies have access to the level of care that they need after they're born, because sometimes things happen. I do think there's a role for that. It's hard to then you're talking about, are we going to do this for free? I think pediatricians, as a general rule, where we don't value our time quite enough. That's part of how we've gotten into this mess in the first place. And so I think that most pediatricians would, if they had the time, happily go and see one of their patients in the hospital for free just as a visit. But we're all very busy. We've got patients to see, we've got families of our own, kids to take care of, soccer practice, all these other things that we're dealing with. And that's the season of life that I'm in right now. Um, and so I think if you were going to try to introduce some kind of telehealth something, we still have to acknowledge that, like, we're bringing value to that situation. And so we'd have to figure out some way to not sort of let the neo keep everything if we're also bringing value. It's a little bit hard to have some of that conversation, but I do think in terms of that relationship, which is super important, like the sooner you can have a conversation and get to meet that baby as well. Because sometimes I have kids that I'm seeing for a 15-month and an 18-month visit. And so I'm talking to mom about the pregnancy as she goes through, and then this baby comes, and it would be really cool to get to see them and tell them congratulations, right? There's like a social aspect to this relationship as well. But in a sense, like, I'm a professional who's bringing value. And if I call and just say congratulations, maybe that's the whole conversation. But every once in a while, you're going to have one of those conversations and they're going to be like, oh, and you know what? He's really not latching as well as my last kid. What tips do you have for that? Or he hasn't pooped yet. Should I be worried about that? Those are the kinds of questions that come up frequently in that context. And if I'm the professional on the phone answering those questions, then that's a value that I'm bringing. And we have to keep that in mind. And it's a hard balance to strike. And I think even as I'm saying this, the words feel a little dirty coming out of my mouth, and I think that's from
Oh,
having it beat into me, as a
no, you're
trainee. We don't do this for the money, but we all have families to feed and those kinds of things, and if I'm a professional bringing value, I think pediatricians are one of the few professionals who frequently just give their stuff away for free, says the guy with a podcast who gives out free medical information. It's a challenge, and I don't quite know how to thread that needle. I think telehealth could play a role if people like that. Not everyone does, but it is a challenge.
So it's interesting because I took the Reach course this weekend and we were talking about implementing some strategies for mental health in the office. And the pediatric psychiatrist is retired now, said, what are some of the barriers? And I looked at him like he was smoking weed. The barriers are the same. We don't have time. We need to get paid. And he says, what do you mean? Talk to your administrator. I'm like, my administrator has nothing to do with how I get paid. This is a policy decision and an MCO decision. Herb, you sounds very frustrated, like you've lost hope. And I'm like, oh, smoking your weed. The reality is that they schedule 4 patients an hour in this clinic, like they do in most practices. If I spend an hour and 15 minutes with one patient, everybody's angry, everybody's stressed, and Medicaid in Virginia pays $65 for an office visit, and they can't afford me to spend an hour with a kid for $65. They need me to see 4 kids at $65 to keep the practice running.
Right.
So it's a problem of time and money. That's a barrier to implement some of these solutions. Not that I don't know how to, not that I can't do the work. It's I don't have the time and we need to be paid, which is exactly what you said.
Does
But
anybody know why the hospital systems or the centers sort of kind of can do it?
do what, George?
Pay
What
for it. The administrators, they pay for services or the salaries or whatever it takes, these extra things, these time things, because they get all these endowments and these grants. That's why. So
well,
they get
some
the grants and they can pay for a social worker. They can pay for the extra time that you need. They can pay for all these things. But when those grants wash out, then they shut down
yeah,
programs.
yes, but even the pediatricians that are employed by large health systems, they're
Mhm,
paid work RVUs. And if you spend an hour with a mental health consult or
mhm,
2 or 3 a day, you will not make enough money as a pediatrician, even in a large health
mhm,
system,
mhm.
because they're reimbursed by WRVUs. So it's not just an independent practice problem, it's an
Right.
every problem.
But I think they put more money into those types of RVUs, those particular procedures. So this way that physician does get paid, but they don't get paid off of insurance. They get paid off of grant funding.
No. So George, so if I see 4 99214s,
Mhm.
two straps and a
Right.
flu and an ear infection, there is no way a 99215 in work RVUs will meet the work RVUs of those 4 patients. You
Okay.
can't. So I'm losing money. My paycheck's gonna be short
Mhm.
if I'm paid on WRVUs. And the administrator is gonna come around and say,
Mhm.
"That's okay, you can take the time, we'll accommodate you, but your paycheck's gonna be short."
That's not good.
If you're okay with
Right.
that, then we're okay. And so what happens, people go, "No, I'm not okay with that because I need to pay bills too." So everybody is affected by this, but you're correct. The care coordination, the social worker, they find grants to fund those, which are very helpful. But I still can't spend an hour with the patient.
Correct.
It's just not can make money.
It's worth
Um,
saying that it's the docs and the care coordinators themselves usually who are scrounging around to try to find grants to fund these places, and then the large hospitals will frequently happily put their names on those grants and claim them, but this is a lot of the sort of also unfunded work that the docs and social workers and these kinds of folks who are working in these large health systems are doing. That was definitely a big challenge for me in the academic world. Is there's so much of the expectations that are placed upon you that are not directly tied to your income. You just have to do them, and if you don't do them, you're in trouble, or in their cases, sometimes they could lose their job completely if they don't find additional grant funding somewhere. I know we were lucky at my clinic in Detroit. We had a couple of social workers in our clinic, but it was not infrequent that there would be this scramble to say, "Oh, can we try to find a grant to get some more social work interns in here, or different kinds of things to try to help just keep the clinic flowing." But it wasn't the hospital system, and I don't think that's unique to the system that I was at in Michigan. I think that's a challenge everywhere for a lot of folks.
Correct.
Scott, what motivated you to change to independent practice?
Listening to the Pediatric Lounge podcast. What else? What else?
That
No,
is that is amazing.
no. I
But
do
but
think.
tell me why, because that
Yeah,
we don't really know the impact we're having, but whenever I hear someone say, "I listened to the podcast and it gave me the courage I needed to do what I want to do." That's like the newborn moment for me, right?
sure.
That's
Yeah.
right.
No, I would say in seriousness, I think it's something that I've always thought about. Like when I dreamed as a kid of being a pediatrician, I was thinking of my local private practice pediatrician, family medicine doc that my parents were taking me to. That's the vision that I had. And so this was always what I thought I wanted to do. And then as I got into the academic world and medical school and residency, I really enjoyed the teaching and some of the aspects of the public health and the research and some of those opportunities that were more easily accessible through the academic world than not. And then I came to a season of life. I left this out of my initial introduction, but I'm married and I have 3 kids. My oldest is 5.5 years old. My youngest is currently 17 months, and I have a 3.5-year-old in the middle, just to complete the set and tell you everybody. And so I came to a place where working as a hospitalist, as much as I loved it, was a lot. It was nights and weekends and holidays and these kinds of things, which were moments when my wife, who's also a physician and works a more traditional more traditional hours, and my kids were home and they weren't at school and they weren't at preschool and those kinds of things. And so that was just time that I was missing with my family in those moments. And it was time that I wanted back. And so I thought pretty seriously about how can I transition either my role within the academic world or look for something different that would allow me to have a little bit more of that time back with them and not miss this time with them. So I'd say that was the primary motivator. And then as I was trying out some different things and talking to different folks, I certainly, especially once we thought we were going to move cross country here, interviewed with a couple of like academic large systems as well. But it was listening to you guys that made me think twice about maybe I should really do some due diligence on some of these smaller independent practices and just see what they're about and how they're run. And is it the kind of environment that I would want to be part of? And then I came down and got to spend time with the folks at the practice that I'm with now and really loved it. The folks here are great. And I learned a little bit about how they run and how they operate. And it seemed like a really good, there is a very true sense that listening to you guys talk about your experiences, again, gave me the inclination to like really do some due diligence on some of these groups and see whether that might be something that I wanted to pursue. And I can say it's been even better for me than I hoped it would be. I was a little bit uncertain stepping out of the academic world and betting on myself in some way, right? I moved from a straight salary model to a base salary with a bonus structure, as I think most folks that in independent practice do, and betting on myself a little bit in that way. And it's been really wonderful. The people I get to work with, having that more direct interaction with the families has been really deeply meaningful for me. And so it's been a good change for me. Maybe I do miss the teaching. I'll probably try to negotiate with the large hospital here to see if I can sneak a resident away once a week or something to get some of that teaching stuff back, because that's definitely the part that I miss the most is interacting with the trainees and doing some of that career counseling and encouraging them to pursue what they want to do. But I think it'll be a good perspective for me to bring, having been in that world and now being in independent practice, because I think most pediatric residents are not exposed to real independent practice. We are put in these large hospital system based clinics, which run totally different from your smaller independent private practice type settings. And so being able to share that and tell folks that like, it's okay if this is what you want to do. It's okay if you want to go into business for yourself, and it's not dirty to want to run your own show and run a private practice. I think pediatricians in particular get a lot of guilt about that in a way that we shouldn't.
Yeah. I think the educational thing is a nice thing to do. If you reach out to the medical director at your school, at the residency program, almost can promise you that they'll set up some kind of a program with you to get the students to rotate at least through an elective. But a bigger bang for your buck would probably be in medical school. I'm sure there's a medical school nearby.
Mm-hmm.
You reach out to the dean and say, look, I want to host a medical student or two once a month. They'll ship them out because they're finding it's becoming more and more difficult to place these students. And believe it or not, pediatrics is a core rotation. Whether you like pediatrics, you don't like pediatrics, they get some value by coming to work with you. You can do some questions with them. You can show them how to be a doctor, basically, how to speak. Because I find students, they come in, they don't know how to speak simple things, HPIs, because they're also computer focused. They talk to the computer instead of talking to the patient. You work with them and the school will they'll work with you.
Yeah, cool. That's a
So,
good tip. I'll
But just go to
reach out to our
medical
local
schools. Just go to the
schools.
medical schools. And the kids, they have to take a test that has pediatrics in it. You must as well learn it. The sad part of, I do this, we have about 5 or 6 students every month that come through our office. The sad part is I almost never find anybody that wants to go into pediatrics. They want to do surgery. They want to do radiology. They want to do internal medicine, but a specialty within internal medicine. At
so
the end of
Scott,
the month, they'll say hi. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you how it's going, but it sounds like you really love being in independent practice.
Yeah, it's been really great. And a big part of that is due diligence and finding the right fit with the right practice. Like the practice that I joined has been so great to me. The owners are wonderful. They really work hard to develop a really good culture, not just for the providers, but also for our MAs and our front office staff and everybody that's involved in the business. They work really hard to kind of, there's always some kind of celebration or something going on that they're
Yeah.
helping to organize.
Cul-
And it's been really, the culture of it has been really, I think, a really key part. And then obviously the work of it, I've really enjoyed as well.
Culture, I think, is very important, incredibly important. Basically, you spend so much time with these people
Absolutely.
that they become your work wives or your work husbands, whatever.
Yeah.
But
I'm
it
the only
is.
guy in my office most days. That's
Isn't that
another
a weird?
challenge.
Isn't that a weird feeling? You're the only male. You know, what I mean,
Uh,
that
it
I'm
it's
always a
amazing how many
minority.
times
I'm
I
always a
get
minority.
families get families who are saying like, "Oh, I didn't realize there was a guy doctor here. That's good to know." Yep, here I am. I'm new around here. So, it's good. We have 2 locations, so there's a guy doctor that's full-time at the other location, and then there's a
Yeah.
second male doctor who kinda bounces back and forth between the 2, but I'm the first, like, permanent male fixture in the office that I'm in quite some time, and so it's been a fun aha moment for a lot, and so it's been good.
I covered a practice of a dear friend of mine, and I walked in one day. There's like a 4-year-old little girl, and she goes, "Where's the doctor?" And she was only used to women doctors, and
Yeah.
she's like, "Where's the doctor?" That's so funny. I just have out of curiosity, does your practice do ASQS screenings on children? The
Uh,
suicide
we
screening,
we use the PHQ that includes the suicide
PHQ-9?
questions in that. Yeah,
Yes.
the PHQ-9, and then yeah, so that's how we do our suicide screening.
And how about the symptom checker? What is that called, George? The PS-17, I think it's called, or
I don't remember the number.
It just keeps going up and up and up
Yeah.
and up. We have a social determinants of health screener that we use, and then we've been using the SWIC as our developmental screener, but we
okay.
don't have yet any kind of like formal mental health screener outside of the PHQ.
But that
And do
SWIC
you
thing is a lot of pages long. How
Yeah, it's
even we use that too, but it's almost impossible to read.
and have
yeah,
you
it's challenging, and sometimes high scores are good, and sometimes high
Yeah.
scores are bad. You wish they would have
Pick one
just
side.
designed it in a way that it was, like, a little more consistent. Yeah, this is my first time using it, so I'm still getting to know it, but it's been a challenge, and the MAs, they have to use their cheat as opposed to the MChat where, like, scoring the MChat is super straightforward and, like, anyone can be trained to do it. The
Right.
SWIC, I feel like every time we have a targeted SWIC, we do it at 3 or 4 of the visits, like, the MAs always have to pull out the cheat sheet and cross-reference it and those kinds of things, and that takes time. So there is a challenge to that. I don't know. I'm not in the weeds enough to know, like, why they made the switch to that, and maybe it is better than what they were using before. I think they were using the PEDS tool before, which is nice because it's a little simpler, but it's a little bit more open-ended, and so maybe that was creating some challenges. I'm not totally sure, but
from a logistic point of view, do you send it to the patients before the visit, or you wait till they're in the exam room to give it to them?
not we do not yet have the ability to send it out. That's something that I have a real interest in terms of the interface between practices and patients and how we can improve that experience, but for now, everything is done in the office as far as I know. There it might be available on the website for them to, like,
Yeah.
print out. I know our behavioral health packet is available and our social determinant screener, they're all, like, on the website, and you can print them out and bring them, but most folks don't.
And then your do you draw blood in the office? So the reason I'm asking is in Virginia, the lead screening and the hemoglobin screening is not paid by the managed care organizations. All the kids that 1 and 2 have to go to LabCorp. Are you able to do capillary blood draws and do the hemoglobin and the lead in the office?
Yeah, so we do capillary blood draws and we do hemoglobin and also we have lipid panels for the insurance providers that will pay for it. Not all of them will do that. And if they don't, then we still have to send them out to the lab. And certainly any kind of formal phlebotomy labs would have to go out. We don't do any of that in our office, but we can do the finger stick hemoglobin and lipids and those kinds of things too.
And when do you screen for lipids? I'm just curious.
We typically do it at the 10-year visit to meet that, like, AAP recommendation that you screen lipids somewhere between 9 and 11 at least one time.
Okay.
I imagine that we found this was certainly my experience in Michigan as well, that if you're doing the 11-year-old shots at 11, kids don't wanna do it then, so you try to get the lipid done at either the 9 or 10-year visit prior to that, but sometimes they don't come in for the 9 or 10-year visit, and so you do it all at the 11.
Okay. And then are you screening for diabetes?
We're not yet. I heard your, episode about that, and I've gotten a little bit more information about it, but we don't have a formalized system for that yet. I need to do a little more research on that, and probably I'm gonna try to reach out to your the guest that you had and see if she'll come on my show and talk a little bit about that from a parent perspective as well. I'm very fascinated by the idea that we could try to find those kids a little bit
Really?
earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah, before they go into DKA, because that's some of the most terrible hospitalist moments are those kids who come in so
Yeah.
stinking sick with DKA.
Yeah, I think as pediatricians, we're more traumatized than even the parents by taking care of DKA. Maybe because we know the risk, right?
Mhm.
A
Yeah,
and it's, basically, it's like taking care of really old patients. They need a transfusion because their hemoglobin's 4, but if you transfuse them, you fluid overload and their heart can't take it, and the heart stops.
yeah,
And it's like a no-win situation, right? And with that
right,
DK, they're in hypovolemic shock, basically,
right.
and you can't correct the hypovolemia too fast because then you could cause brain edema, and then you could herniate and not have a patient. It's to me, it's very traumatic. This is one of those
And in a
things
real
that's
sense,
really
I can't ever help but think if only there was no reason to, but if only somebody would have just checked this kid's blood sugar 2 days ago, we might have avoided this
avoided.
whole situation or noticed that there was some sugar in their urine, which, like, there was no reason to do that, and you know that objectively, but you just can't help but think when this kid is so sick in front of you, like,
Yeah.
if
You know
only
what's
they had
very interesting?
accidentally gotten a glucose.
You know what's very interesting? When I worked in the hospital, everybody came in with DKA. Went into private practice. We've diagnosed plenty of children with diabetes, but not one ever in my entire career presented with DKA. Interesting.
Yeah,
Why is that? Access to care.
yeah,
You call up, come in. I found a diabetic kid on the checkup where he had like a 30-pound weight loss. The people come in, the mother suspects drinking too much, urinating too much. You do a blood sugar, you diagnose it. But it's
right.
always diagnosed inside the office and sent over to the hospital. They never end up in DKA. But the DKA is only in the hospital. And I think it's with patients that don't have access to the physician
Yeah.
easily.
Or don't even think that they have a good enough relationship with a physician to call and 'cause maybe it seems like a silly question, right? It seems like he's drinking a little too much. What does that even mean? I think
Uh, the
that's another
antidote
place where that relationship
yeah.
becomes really
What are your
important.
thoughts on that, Herb?
The
I'm sure you
antidotes
have
are
some
that
thoughts.
the antidotes are great. Um, however, 50 to 55% of kids who present with diabetes are in DKA. One out of every 2 kids that presents with new onset diabetes are in DKA. So the antidotes are great. And then I would ask you, do you have a machine that does pH in your office? What was the pH of these kids that you diagnosed?
Those are the ones that end up in the hospital.
No, but what was the pH? You said you didn't see
Oh,
diabetes.
you don't, you suspect diabetes and then you send them on off to the
But what
hospital.
was that
Yeah.
pH at the time of diagnosis on this kid that you diagnosed and this
Well,
was?
they never ended up in the ICU for the
Well,
drips
the
and
George,
everything.
what was the pH? The question is
I
what was
don't
the
know.
pH?
In
Okay,
the
so
office, I
let's
don't
say
know.
he wasn't on DKA. He may not have been in DKA sick enough to be in the ICU, but without knowing the pH, we don't know if he or she was in DKA or not.
Correct.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
obviously, early, that's the magic of pediatrics. What you do is early
Diagnosis.
diagnosis
Yes.
Yeah.
leads to better outcomes,
Mhm.
not
Every
for the patient, but also clinically, but also less expensive care. That's the magic of having a well-run pediatric office. You do a great job because even if this kid's pH was acidotic, he got caught early enough, he didn't end up in the ICU,
Right.
and that's a big win. That's a
Yeah.
big win.
And going back to the access of for care conversation is even if that family called to say, "Hey, I'm worried about my kid. They're peeing too much. They're drinking too much, whatever. When can you get me in?" "Oh, we can get you in 2 days at 3 PM." It's always
Yeah.
Friday at 3 PM when these kids come in. And so, like, the access becomes important too when, excuse me, are we running our clinic in a way that we have space for these kids when they call in with these sort of concerning findings, say, "Yeah, we can get you in today. Can you be here in an hour?" Like those kinds of conversations as well, which is another thing that somehow I find that the practice that I've joined has done a really good job of is they leave these spots for our in-house nurse triage folks to decide who needs to be seen today and who can wait until tomorrow and those kinds of things and trying to be able to get those kids in who are calling with things that could escalate and they can't wait 24 hours or 48 hours. Like we really should try to see them today. Like we can try to get them in, but that only happens in the context of run relationship driven pediatric offices.
Absolutely. Tell
Interesting.
me more about your podcast, Talks to Dad.
Sure. So the Docs to Dads podcast is my creative outlet. It is a parenting podcast that's primarily oriented towards dads because I feel like fathers frequently get left out of a lot of these parenting conversations. And I think, especially as some of my generation and after me have started to become dads, we're very interested in being actively engaged in what's happening in our home and raising our kids and being a part of those things. And we recognize, I mentioned my wife is a physician, and if we want to live in a world, which I do, where she can go out and be the amazing physician that she is, that means that I'm working hard in my career as well, but that everything that happens at home is a team effort. And I'm a big part of that, and I want to be a big part of that. And having conversations with dads who maybe don't have the skills developed over years of babysitting or other kinds of caring expectations that generally aren't put on young men to help them feel prepared and confident and competent to care for their kids. There's so many dads out there who the first time they ever hold a baby, it's their baby that's being handed to them. And then they're like, I don't know what to do. I've never changed a diaper. I don't know how to feed a baby. I don't know how to change a baby. When do they sleep? How do they sleep? What is a burp? All of these kinds of things. And so trying to speak into that gap a little bit to help dads along that journey and have the medical information that they need and the parenting information that they need to try to contribute to what's happening in their home in the way that they want to. And that's the spirit of what Docs to Dads is all about. It's just helping dads be confident and competent caregivers.
Interesting.
And where can people find this podcast?
Yeah, so Docs to Dads is available on all the major podcast platforms. If you search Docs to Dads, DOCS, the number two, Dads, DADS, you'll find it on all the major podcast platforms. I started out the early episodes were starting from the beginning to say, like, you just found out you're pregnant. What do you do now? And then what's going to happen through pregnancy and what happens at the hospital and then right when you get home, and then there's some breastfeeding troubleshooting, overcoming useless nipples, sorts of like, how can I as dad help my partner who's trying to breastfeed, some of those kinds of things. And then from there it's expanded and grown, and now we're at almost 100 and or over 100 episodes. There's a lot of stuff out there for folks that are interested.
So I
And you
understand
have a
your
website?
wife is a physician, right?
That's correct.
That must have been tough, or it's gonna be tough to manage both your career and her career and three children, and little league and baseball and lessons and ballet and all that other stuff.
Uh,
How should a doctor or a dad doctor deal with this kind of stuff?
I,
Her-
I
First of all, his
go ahead.
wife is an ophthalmologist.
So what? There's a
That's true.
doctor, and she has
Well, they have a
responsibility.
much better schedule than pediatricians. Ophthalmology, dermatology have it the best schedule.
Yeah, but they still gotta go to the office, and they
They
still
got to
gotta
go to
see
the
patients.
office, and she's got an
It's
OR
still a real
day,
doctor,
and you know,
okay?
thanks, George. Yeah, I think it all comes down to communication, and we have to just to work together between my wife and I to figure out what's going on. We have a master family calendar that kind of helps keep us all updated and organized. And it seems silly to talk about some of this nitty gritty stuff. Obviously, our whole family is built on the foundation of our relationship. So I think investing in our relationship frequently, spending time together. We try at least once a year to get a couple of days away that are just the two of us without the kids so that we can reconnect with each other and touch base and how are things going. And then little date nights here and there. And then beyond that, it's a lot of really practical stuff. It's the communication. We probably text even more than we talk because we're not in the same room most of the time. So we're constantly like sending stuff back and forth to each other. Like I said, we have a master family calendar. That's a Google Calendar on our phones that we can put things on. And I tell her, like, if you want something done, just put it on the calendar and it'll get done. If it's not on the calendar, it's probably not going to happen. That's my mild ADHD coming through, but
My relationship with George,
maybe
put it on
that's
the
part of
Google
every good
Calendar.
functioning,
Yeah.
healthy relationship.
So
Is it all
I
comes
do
down to
want to ask you
communication.
something here because this is you pointed out to something that's incredibly important. And I tell the parents a 2-week visit. You need to schedule a date with each other because this 2-week old will turn 14 or 15 one day, have a life of their own,
Yep.
and you have a spouse still at home,
Yep.
and you can't forget that.
Mhm.
Do you advise your parents too about the importance of their relationship and the impact that has on their own children?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I used to joke with the residents all the time, especially in the medical world. Like, you spend all this time trying to find somebody that you like enough to marry, and then you don't actually end up spending that much time with them after that because you're both so busy working and doing various things. And so it does take intentionality. I think that's the most important thing is like you have to,
Yeah.
it's not just going to happen on its own. You have to set that time aside. And I'm frequently amazed when I talk to colleagues at how few of them have had a date night recently, or like when was the last time you just like went away without the kids? They haven't been away from the kids for any period of time. And not every that takes some intentionality, right? And it takes some
Right.
saving sometimes to be able to get childcare for the
Right.
kids or to try to pawn them off on grandparents for a little while so that you can get away and do a date night. But I
But
think it's so true that everything that happens in your family is built on the foundation of the relationship of the parents, right?
yeah.
And if my relationship with my wife starts to fall apart, then everything falls apart and we have to reconnect. And sometimes that's a really important thing. And so I try to encourage that from early on. Sometimes it's hard to convince the parents of this newborn, especially first time newborn parents, that they should spend any amount of time away from their kid. But eventually we get there, and I think it's really important that you have to take that time to continue to invest in that relationship, and that relationship has to come first, even before the relationship with any of the kids, because that's the foundation that everything else is built on. And if you don't have that good to go, then everything else will start to fall apart.
I love that, Scott. I really love that. That is such a basic principle. Because pediatricians, we talk so much about relationships, and we
Hmm.
forget how important the parent mother, the father mother relationship is on the kids, or father or mother, whatever it is. And also for us personally, our own relationships with work, they have to be balanced with what we do as human beings. Because if that becomes unbalanced, then we're not able to help the kids, either at home or in the office. I've listened to many of your podcasts. It's a wonderful show, and I've been a guest in your podcast, and I much appreciate that. And so it's a very well done podcast, and I think very much needed because people forget about the impact fathers can have on their children's lives. Scott, thank you so much for waking up early in Arizona, and thank you for what you do for the kids, and thank you for the podcast. And I hope to see you again, maybe at NCE or another conference.
Yeah, thank you guys both very much
Yeah.
for what you do. It definitely played a role in my decision making as I was making this big career move, and I know that what you're putting out there is making a difference and is helping a lot of folks. So I'm really grateful to you and to you, Dr. Bravo, for coming on my show and always sharing my episodes on LinkedIn and other social media platforms as well. It's always a big help to me. So I'm really grateful to you for all your support.
I'm
Thank you.
happy to do that. It's really my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
guys.